Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Crushing Land. Today, we're going to be talking about a subject that faces pretty much every land investor as they get going at some point, particularly those on the eastern side of the country. It doesn't exist as much on the West Coast, but still, as you get going, things that you will face. Flood zones, floodplains, and wetlands. What do they mean? How do they affect us? Do we invest in those areas? What's the difference? Is there a difference? That's what we're going to be talking about today. So stay with us here for a few minutes. We'll try to give you a little bit of education on this and see how it relates to land investing. So first off, are those things interchangeable? We hear people all the time be like, oh, this property has wetlands on it. And then somebody's like, well, I don't buy properties in flood zones. Is that the same thing? They're not. There is a difference between wetlands, flood zones, and flood plains. So we're going to take a few minutes and we're going to talk about what that difference is. And then we're going to talk about our investing in those different areas. So first off, let's start with a flood plain. What is a flood plain? It's literally the land that's right on the side of water that as the water moves, it floods. So you think about maybe like a major river, the Mississippi River or something like that, that area that's on both sides, that when the river floods, it's going to go, up in there and all that. That is a flood plain, prone to flooding, an area that does flood quite regularly. So floodplains are usually along rivers. It's on the coast too, and things like that. Not as much on the coast. It could be along lakes, things like that, but usually along areas that expand as a bunch of water comes in. If a bunch of water falls in the ocean, it doesn't do anything. If a bunch of water falls in a big lake, it doesn't do anything. If a bunch of water falls and it lands in a river, it's going to flood. So that area around it where it does that is called a flood plain. You're going to see that usually that land is agricultural land. Why? Because nobody's going to build there. And two, it's very fertile land. It's good land for crops. And so it does very well because it's well watered, has good soils, all of that for growing things. Generally speaking, it's agricultural land. So will we invest in a floodplain? Of course, yes. Are we going to invest with the idea of building a house on it? No, but we're land investors, so we're not worried about that. We're going to pass that along, and maybe an agricultural person is going to want to buy it. So we have purchased properties in floodplains. What's a flood zone? This one's interesting because I hear people all the time say, we do not invest in flood zones. Flood zone just means how prone is it to flooding. There could be something called flood zone X, which means it's not prone at all. There's flood zone A, E, all these different flood zones. And basically what they all mean is how prone is it to get, it goes up to 500 years. So it could be like there'd be a flood once every 500 years. They call it a 500-year flood. There's a 100-year flood. You get a massive flood every 100 years. You'll get a massive flood every 5 years. It really varies by the flood zone. So how likely is that area to flood? That's what a flood zone is. It's not a science. Well, it is, but it's not like guaranteed. The area that I live in, for example, had a 100-year flood 20 years ago. We also had one last year. So obviously they can come up more often than expected. Now, me personally, I'm elevated. I don't have properties in the flood zone where my house is and things like that. But there are parts that are in that flood zone. And even though it was only a 100-year flood and it's not even in a flood zone, the property still came up twice. There was a flood twice in the last 20 years. So it just shows you that they can come. It doesn't always happen. There's no real, it's weather. There's no way of guaranteeing that it's going to happen one way or the other. Do we run away from flood zones? That's the big one, right? People are like, well, I don't invest in flood zones. That's stupid. Seriously, that's straight up stupid. Some of the best properties are in flood zones. People like to live on water, right? There's a reason that the nicest houses are on the ocean. The nicest houses are on lakes. The nicest houses, you go even like in a lake that's rather small. I'm not saying tiny little lake with 3 houses around. I'm saying, a decent sized lake with hundreds of houses around it, but not the Great Lakes or anything like that. But if you have a lake like that, there's houses all around the edges because people want to live on water. They want to go boating. They want to do things like that. But you know what? Their houses are most likely in a flood zone. So flood zones do not mean to run away, especially from the perspective of a land investor. Investing in houses, it's up to you. What's going to happen there is if you have a mortgage, you're going to have something called flood insurance. It's going to be required. which is pricey in certain cases. But it doesn't mean people still invest in this all the time because these houses are more valuable. Half the state of Florida, it's so low elevation, it's surrounded by water, is in a flood zone. We've done tons of investments in Florida, both with land and with houses, with properties in flood zones. It didn't matter. So when people tell you don't invest in flood zones, they honestly don't know what they're talking about. They're thinking, oh, it's bad, it's going to flood, there's going to be problems, I can't do anything. We've sold so many properties in flood zones, so don't let that distract you. Finally, wetlands. What is wetlands? Well, wetlands is really broad. It can be anything from just a light, marshy, just a little bit of soils that are kind of spongy that you don't even really feel walking on it, all the way to like standing water. So in reality, a property can be in all three things. It can be in a floodplain, it can be in a high flood zone, which it would be if it's in a floodplain, and it can be wetlands. Do we invest in wetland properties? That's the one where we step back big time. I'm not saying we don't invest, but that's where we step back big time. What you need to do here is you need to find out what can be done in any of those properties. That's the bottom line there with any of that in that situation. Wetlands vary. They're all over the place as to what you can do in them, where things are, if you can build in them. Some of you can, some of you can't. Some of you just got to do light work to, some of you just got to do a little bit of movement. Some of them are kind of fringe, and other ones are just like absolutely not. Some of them are protected wetlands, meaning you can't do anything. So you need to know what that is. The only way you're going to do that is to actually speak to somebody that deals with wetlands, the Department of Environmental Protection or whatever it is. So you take that case by case as properties come along. We've invested in properties with wetlands on them. We've invested in properties that are mostly wetlands. There is still potential there, but you just need to know what you're dealing with. So it does vary property to property. I'm not going to go into this long spiel about what that is. It's something that you can find out as you're going along. So again, just to reiterate our points today as we're discussing this, when it comes to floodplains, think about along moving water generally, the area that as it starts to crest and goes up, that would be a floodplain. Flood zones, how often and how prone is it to flooding? Not something we run away from in either case. With the floodplain, we know what we're dealing with. We know it's probably not going to be buildable land, but it's still sellable land. People want that. When you're talking about a flood, that's the water, like that's the area literally right on the edge, right where it starts to come up and crest and things like that. That part of it, that part of the river or whatever the body of water is. Then the flood zone is what's beyond that. The different flood zones start to expand. They can be anywhere along based on elevation. So again, you can be in any type of flood zone. We definitely don't run away from those. And then wetlands, those vary from pretty limited. They're there, but they don't really restrict too much. It's pretty easy to get around, all the way up to you can't touch this. And so again, in that case, you need to reach out to the right people that are handling that, talk to them, find out what can be done, if anything, with the property. So just a little bit of information for you on floodplains, flood zones, and wetlands. Thank you so much for joining us. Make sure that you subscribe. Make sure that you're here regularly. Make sure to join our Facebook group at golandmethod.com and check out everything that we have to offer. So thanks a lot, and see you guys.